Welcome back to the Newell Elementary Science Fair Project Student Handbook. In this video, we are going to be looking at Step 6. Step 6 applies to both experiments and research projects. And Step 6 is vital for you to do so that you can have the best results out of your project. In Step 6, we are looking at our rubrics. And so in Step 6, you want to check that your plans and your project meet the requirements that you need for maximum amount of points on your rubric. And the rubrics are on the last 2 pages of the handout, or the handbook. So we'll start with the experiment rubric. In the experiment rubric, we have several sections here. Creative ability, which is worth 10 points. Scientific thought, 20 points. Skill and thoroughness, 40 points. The display, 10 points, and your logbook, which is worth 20 points. For creative ability, we're talking about whether or not your idea was an original idea. Is it something that you could answer creatively? Was your display board creative? And was your project age appropriate? We don't want something that's too easy for you. We don't want something that's too hard for you. But how did you do as far as just what you picked for your topic? Was it a creative idea that works for you? Scientific thought. Does the project follow every step of the scientific process? Do you have your starting question, your hypothesis, your materials, your procedures, your observations, your data and results, your conclusions, your resources, the people giving credit to the people who took any pictures for you? Do you have every step of that scientific process in your logbook and on your display board? Is the investigation controlled? We talked about control with experiments back when we were writing our proposal. Control is those things that you keep the same across the whole project. Does the experiment answer the title or the question? So, in other words, what you did in the experiment, does it directly relate to what you were trying to find out? And were you able to answer that question either in the positive or in the negative? Were you able to answer that question with your experiment? Skill and thoroughness, and this is a big category. It's worth 40 points. This is getting into the meat and details of your experiment. Is the project complete? Did you get all the way through all the steps? Did you come up with a conclusion? Are all the steps represented on your board? Because remember, your display board is showing what you did. If you did it, it should be somewhere on your display board. Did the student tell specific amounts of materials? Again, being very specific about what you used in the experiment. Did the student measure accurately? You have to have some evidence that you measured accurately. Was enough data collected? You should have at least 3 trials and samples, meaning, going back to that example we gave with the fertilizer with the plant, it's not just that you would have 3 different fertilizers you're testing, but within that, at least 3 plants to test fertilizer 1, at least 3 plants to test fertilizer 2, and at least 3 plants to test fertilizer 3, as well as 3 control plants. Because the more samples you have, the more trials you run, the more accurate your data is. Did the student choose the best method for recording data? Did you use a chart? Did you use a graph? Did you have some other way of showing your data? Did the hypothesis and conclusion relate to the original question and to each other? So in other words, if you asked a question, is your hypothesis directly answering that question? And your conclusion, did it answer your question and tie in with the hypothesis? So that's a big section, the skill and thoroughness section. The display, this is getting down to just the physical, your board that you display. Is the information and data displayed in a way that's easy to read? So did you make it nice and bold, or is it tiny? Is it medium size? How did you write it? Is it easy to read on the board? Is it neat? All the information or data on the board relates directly to the project, meaning you have nothing that's extra. If your project is about fertilizing plants, then you shouldn't have anything about rocks and minerals on it, or about caterpillars, because it's about the fertilizing the plants. So it has to be directly related to the project or the experiment. The information presented shows the student has an understanding of the topic and the experiment that he or she has chosen. So, did you know what you were doing? Did you really understand what you were doing in the experiment? Because often we get projects where it's obvious that mom or dad did it, and mom or dad had the understanding, but when you go to talk about your project, you can't really tell about it because you didn't really do it. So you have to show that you understand what was happening in your experiment and you understand what you did in the experiment that you chose. The steps of the experiment are clearly labeled and are legible. Again, neatness counts. If I can't read it, if your teacher can't read it, how are we going to be able to score it and judge it? Make sure you've labeled pictures. Make sure you've labeled charts and data and graphs and things that you have on your board. Do you have the headings explaining this is the hypothesis, this is the procedure, this is the conclusion, and so on? The display is clear, neat, and complete. Again, we can see exactly what you've done. Everything is clear on the board. I can tell where your hypothesis is. I can tell where your data is. I can tell that you have everything there. Student shows data on the display using a graph, table, or chart. Again, if you have data you've collected, you should have it displayed somehow in an organized way. And has credit been given to the photographer? So if you took any pictures, who took the pictures? Make sure you give them credit for it. The logbook, and this is often a problem area with students. You have to be keeping a logbook throughout your entire experiment. And it starts back at that beginning when you do your research. You should have information about what you learned leading up to your experiment, as well as what you did in your experiment and all the steps, all your observations, what were your results. If you measured things, you should have it recorded in your logbook. All those things are in your note, in that logbook. And this here lists out exactly what we should see in there. You should have evidence that you've used it throughout the experiment. That's the purpose of a logbook. It's a place to record what happened in the experiment. And then the last thing, of course, in here is could you read this report easily and repeat the experiment? So that means that everything that you did should be in that logbook so that if anyone wanted to pick it up and do your experiment, they could replicate it and do the same thing again. If you're doing a research project, the research project rubric looks like this, and this is again broken down into categories. You have organization, creativity, science content, level of difficulty, writing, sources, and components. And we're going to focus on 4s because we want to get a 4 in each of these categories. So if it's organized, that means we have clear headings, it flows nicely, it's complete and detailed. Creativity, you've made strong efforts, you're interested in it's interesting to read or view, you've used color, picture, or diagrams, it's very neat. Science content, your research information is correct and supported by your sources, your ideas are fully developed, and your scientific insight is present. Level of difficulty means it's appropriately challenging for your grade level, and that you have strong evidence of understanding, meaning you could tell me about this topic even more than what you did on that board. You thoroughly understand it because you researched it, you gathered a lot of information, and if you're interested in the topic, you should be able to tell me a lot about it. Writing. No mistakes in writing, meaning your spelling, grammar, and punctuation is correct, or there's very tiny errors that do not distract from the reader, or do not distract the reader. And so that's why that editing and revising phase is so important in your research project. Sources, you have a bibliography included, properly completed, and you have at least 3 sources. So this is on the display board, not just in the logbook. Components, the notebook is completed and shows good evidence of effort, information is displayed on the board, title is present, and you have at least 3 subheadings. So again, you start everything in your logbook, but eventually the final product, your final writing, is displayed on the display board.